Welcome to the Big Ideas in App Architecture podcast. I'm your host, Tim Vale, and joining me today is Ken Pickering, the Senior Vice President of Engineering at Starburst Data. Ken, I thought I would just kind of read a little bit about what I understand your background to be, and then, certainly fill in the gaps or add to it if you like to. But you got your bachelor's degree from University of Virginia in computer science. Ultimately got a master's degree in computer science from UMass Lowell, and then kind of went on to do all sorts of really exciting roles. One of the reasons I was kind of so interested and excited to talk to you today is your background kind of in software engineering and architecture is really, really impressive. You've had a lot of kind of unique and different experiences. Most recently at Rue La La, and then at Hopper, where you were head of engineering, and of course now we have the pleasure of talking to you as SVP of engineering at Starburst Data. I know I didn't go into all the details, but is that a fair summary of kind of your journey to date?
Yeah, absolutely. I've got the privilege of working in both, B2B and B2C systems, which has been kind of interesting from a architecture and capacity planning and engineering perspective. So yeah.
Now, one thing I'm always curious about it, and maybe it's because I was just at Disney World with the family and kind of thinking back about childhood and aspirations and growing up. I found myself in an engineering capacity not long after graduating, but I don't know that that's ever what I thought I was going to do. You not only got a bachelor's degree in computer science, but a master's degree. I mean, is that kind of what you'd always wanted to do? Is get into technology? Be an engineering leader, or did you have aspirations to do other things kind of as you was growing up? I'm always just curious about kind of how people wind up kind of where they are today, like you and I are here in this kind of technical field.
So I think, I took apart my record player when I was 6 to sort of like see how it worked, right? And
Right.
So I think like I've always had this intrinsic curiosity as to how things are built and how things operate. But actually, engineering was a side hustle for at my time, my music career. So,
Oh, really?
I grew up. I really love music. I played the violin and then the trumpet, and then later in life picked up like bass and drums and stuff like that. And my parents were like, you can't be a music major. Like, absolutely not. Like that's not a career. Like, I was like, all right. Like, I'll do this. I started out in electrical engineering.
Okay.
And then pivoted to computer engineering, which was sort of new at the time. But it was like a hybrid of EE and CS work. I'd say it's like, like doing FPGA type stuff before the days of Raspberry Pis. And so, I was happy I did it, right? Because the music thing just sort of fell apart. But yeah, so I mean, like, I didn't get into this 100% thinking I'd be an engineer someday. But that's just sort of fell into the profession, and I've always liked math and science and technology. So
yeah, it's great. I do a very similar background. I don't know that I ever took apart a record player, but pretty close. I did a lot of deconstructing and reconstructing of things. So it's no surprise. I think we find ourselves in the kind of profession that we're in. So let's talk a little bit about Starburst Data. You've been there, I guess at this point it'd be a little over 2 years, or maybe right at the 2-year mark. Starburst is a really fascinating company. It itself has had kind of an interesting journey, but tell me a little bit about, kind of what Starburst is, a little bit more about kind of the role that you're playing there. I'd love to hear what the day in the life of at Starburst is, and really what Starburst is about.
absolutely. So Starburst is based on the open source project Trino, formerly known as Presto.
Right.
And I'd say Starburst, the company, has a couple different origin stories in regards to that. I mean, the Presto project was worked by 3 of our CTOs, Dane, David, and Martine, at Facebook for quite some time. And it was really designed to solve the problem of like, how do you query internet scale data, right? Like the best common practices at the time were like data warehousing. But if your data is so physically large that you can't warehouse it, like what do you do, right? And so it's a very interesting and cool and occasionally somewhat complicated piece of technology. And so the other side of the company is more of the business side, which comes out of the days of Adapt. So Justin Borgman, our CEO, was the co-founder of Adapt, and he's always had this vision of like SQL on top of like unstructured storage or alternative storage types, right? And so when the company was acquired by Teradata, Justin and the team started working with, at the time, Presto, and saw the potential of it. And so Starburst was founded after that to work directly with Presto and the Presto community. And then, after Dane, David, and Martine left Facebook and forked the project, everybody came together at Starburst and sought to, I'd say, bring Presto, now Trino, to the masses, right? And actually leverage this technology in a way that can lift all sorts of businesses, not just internet scale companies. So that's what we've been working on. It's a very kind of open, stereotypical open core journey, right? We have the open source technology, widely utilized by some of the biggest companies in the world. We build the enterprise platform, and we have a ton of customers on the enterprise platform. And now we're in the cloud platform part of the journey, right? Like, how do we, as a business, make it simple, easy to use, any company can do it, right? And leverage Trino in that capacity.
It's I spent some time at Hortonworks, and so was kind of had a front row seat during kind of the heady days of Hadoop and big data, and certainly at that time Presto, was a very, very interesting technology. One of the things I'm curious about is I think in a large part Hadoop kind of peaked a little bit in terms of its I don't know, mass appeal. I don't know how you might characterize it, but I think Starburst has done a wonderful job of continuing to be, a very, very attractive technology for those big data problems. I mean, I know you've only been there a couple of years, but, I just wonder what your perspective is on that kind of journey from, the heady days of Hadoop when everybody had to have a Hadoop solution and a big data to something, that's very different now with the emergence of cloud. I don't know if that's something you've thought much about, but I'm always curious about companies that kind of started in those early days and have managed to transition kind of in this journey that's in some ways kind of a post Hadoop era.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, the Hadoop era really set the stage for where we are today in terms of data technology and data analysis, right? Like, I'd say that some of the inspiration of Presto in the first place was derived from Hadoop, right? So where I think Starburst and the Trino project excel, right, is what we're really trying to do is actually push for the separation of storage and compute, right? And that's if you work with us, if you buy the product, I think you lean into that axiom of you can separate compute and storage, right? Which is a stark differentiation from the coupled data warehouse or cloud data warehouse Snowflake model of coupling both things together. So I think that's where, but I think that's that purity of concept of separation of storage and compute tier is what's carrying the vision forward, right? And then I think that being able to provide optionality of where customers can choose to store the data, and the federation capacities of Trino to do query federation across Mongo or S3 object storage or traditional databases or Snowflake, right? To be able to do that gives customers the ultimate freedom and flexibility to store their data where they want and leverage it how they see fit, and not be tied into okay, well, a huge part of Starburst early years was I have Snowflake, but I also have Cloudera, right? And how do I marry these two things, right? Because I don't want to move everything in Cloudera to Snowflake, right? And so, but Starburst can come in and solve that problem, and so you can do data migration, but it gives you that kind of single source of truth, or that kind of fabric layer on top of everything to drive business results. Because at the end of the day, that's what most customers are most concerned with, is how am my analysts making insights, right? I'm on this cloud transformation journey, sure, but it's going to take a while, and how do we as a company actually continue operating our business while underneath maybe we're doing other things or incorporating new technologies into the mix, but then saying but now how do I transform this data and get it into the cloud data warehouse, right? Someone brought in Mongo, and now we don't know what to do with all the data in Mongo, right? And so solving those problems is sort of I think that's the thing that the technology does super well, right? That's definitely the sweet spot of the technology.
Yeah, so I'd love to understand a little bit more, or hear you talk a little bit more about this kind of this separation of compute and storage, because again, that's something that we find at Cockroach to be, I think, a place directionally we want to head, more and more, because there are fundamental limitations when those things, I think, are bound together. But
Yeah.
from an application architecture and ultimately performance, which leads again to something I think you called out, which is important to understand, is business value. I mean, what are you seeing or not seeing that working to effectively separate those things is done for the business over the technology itself? I mean, I think in other words, it's a really key architectural concept I'd like to explore.
Yeah. So what it lends really well is I think it makes the concept of a data lake much more functional, but it doesn't specifically require everything be in a data lake. And that, like, I think a lot of companies are going into the data lake plus, it's just what we call it internally, is like data lake and a couple other things type strategy of like, you're landing everything in a lake, but also you have data other places, and that's kind of okay, and we'll figure out how to get it there eventually. But I'd say it's the combination of like exceptionally cheap object storage, right?
Yeah.
Like exceptionally cheap ways to store all of your data, and then how do you leverage it in a way that's performant on top of it, right? And so I'd say, but then you also have app databases and other things you want to include into the mix, and like where do those fit into the scenario? And a good example is like in the consumer space, like new feature development, right? Like where maybe your object model isn't 100% solidified, or you're not 100% focused on what metrics you're tracking, but how do you actually join that with other large data sets, right? And how do you actually link that to like marketing inbound data or something like that is a good use case for the technology, because like in a lot of places, especially more mature, like digital native companies, they're already landing a ton of data in Lake, but it's not also the source of truth. And so like, there are definitely two ways to solve that problem. The first is sort of like, okay, well, we link everything and everything goes to Snowflake and we feed Snowflake. We just, don't see the need for that. Right. And we think that, if you can aid in things like schema discovery, Starburst has leaned heavily into like the concept of data products, or like the concept of like data APIs. Like, how do you actually define and scope data in a way that makes it easier to consume, and then thinking about like lineage and other things, like how do you actually like take something as unstructured as a data lake and produce like useful, viable outcomes has been a big area of research for us. So, yeah.
One thing I'm always curious about, and we see this as at Cockroach, where, when we look out at the market, there are just so many databases and so many data. You said data products, but I guess I'm using the term a little differently here.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just so many places to put things, right? And ultimately, the companies that we work with, want to get them out of a transactional system or get it into or out of a transactional system. But, as I think you guys see day in and day out, data can kind of get and be everywhere.
Yeah.
For us, the amount of different places people are looking to put things or have put things, or applications that are over here using Postgres, over here using MySQL, over here using Mongo. And there's just, I guess where I'm going is there's just so many products out there. Has that been a challenge for Starburst to walk into a company and say, oh geez, we have to build yet some other integration that we didn't have before in order to kind of fully realize the potential of pulling all this data together? Or is that a problem you guys have effectively kind of solved, over the years? Or are you still finding that, hey, every day there's some new thing we're being asked to integrate with?
Yeah, I think, so we do run into that problem, but I think like one of the benefits of the technology is the the pluggable agent architecture, right? Like in that, like we design, like Trino and Presto were designed out of the get-go to have a pluggable architecture to incorporate new connectors, right? And so because of that, I think it's easier for us to adopt new connector patterns and keep abreast. The other part's the community aspect of it too. Like a lot of our connectors actually come in from the community, and so someone wants to write a connector for X because they use it at their company, and they write it, right? And Starburst directly benefits from that contribution. Occasionally, I would say that we definitely focus on like ruggedizing and testing connectors we bring in from the community in that regard. But like at the end of the day, like the ecosystem itself kind of feeds it. So there's occasionally things we run into in terms of like some of the bigger companies with their own like homebrew open source projects where they extended a specific open source technology, which is always like,
people aren't really doing that, are they?
Oh no, yeah, they do that. But like, then that's like a case by case decision,
Yeah.
right? It's like,
Yeah.
do we integrate with this or not? But yeah, no, I'd say like the good thing about the tech is that it was designed to be this adaptable, and so we're not
Perfect.
fighting against every single connector we run into. So
Yeah, it just, from our perspective, it's just amazing to me. It seems like every day there's a new
oh yeah, this is a
database
new
or
thing. Yeah.
a new something or other that people are asking about. And I think if our job was to figure out how to connect to all those things, which it doesn't necessarily, it'd be daunting.
Yeah, I
You
mean, it's
did touch on,
definitely. I was gonna say, definitely having to Google a new technology is kind of
yeah,
embarrassing sometimes. Like you're like, oh, I haven't
yeah.
heard about it. Like, yeah, exactly. So
As an SVP, you're supposed to have all the answers.
I
SVP of
should.
engineering, have all the answers to every question that's asked. I
Yeah,
know that's how I feel sometimes. But you're right. I mean, the amount of time I have to look up things is amazing. You mentioned something. I kind of wanted to shift a little bit to maybe
yeah,
to kind of the people aspect. So you
sure.
mentioned community. As the SVP of engineering and somebody who is responsible for kind of wrangling, I think not only employees of Starburst but ultimately contributors who may or may not be employed.
Yep.
Talk to me a little bit about kind of how you guys organize your work. I know there are many different philosophies about how to organize engineering teams. I've always been fascinated and have worked with open source projects in the past. So just kind of curious how you not only philosophically kind of organizing your team, but how are you incorporating kind of that broader ecosystem of community contributors in order to kind of to build the ultimate vision for Starburst?
Yeah, it's one of those like case by case things where in some cases, especially like connectors is a great example, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like because that is an atomic unit of work, and in a lot of ways, like it's easier for people to contribute those than like core engine enhancements. And I'd say it's much more of a partnership model, right? We believe that like if we help invest in the community, that we can reap rewards from that. And so like having Starburst, because I'd say we employ probably the most like Presto Trino experts in the world at this point, right? And so like it is assisting to help lift, right? And so like that could be community management, that's assistance in PRs, that's making sure that we're providing timely feedback. We have people manning the Slack, the open source Slack, to answer questions and help people get unblocked. And so I'd say it's really just like having a practical level of investment in the community, and helping to lift it. Like making sure that if someone comes in, like they have a positive experience with the Trino community, right? Like, and that we're clear and concise on either why or why not, like an initiative should be taken on and accepted, because I mean, just we get just as many things that are probably not as appropriate for the project as are
Right.
appropriate for the project, right?
Right.
But I'd say like when Dane, David, and Martine founded the Trino Software Foundation, like the growth of the community was really top of mind for them, and so we are a majority of the maintainers and a majority of the contribution to it. But I'd say making sure that we at Starburst are continually like keeping an eye on how we make it better is a huge part of it.
How big is the team out of curiosity? The engineering
We're
team?
engineers about 150 today.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah. So
It's a big team. And are they everywhere? I mean, kind of in all corners of the world at this point?
yeah, we are. We employ. We operate really globally. So we have offices in Palo Alto, Austin, Boston,
Yeah.
London, Paris, Warsaw, and Tel Aviv.
Jeez.
But we have employees in India and Japan and South America and all over Europe and all over the U.S. and Canada. So, yeah, we are a global remote first company. So.
Now, is part of your role and responsibility to get to travel to all those destinations regularly, or is that something that is not necessarily required?
No, it is. I go to Poland and Tel Aviv a moderate amount of times, Palo Alto once a quarter,
Okay.
and I'll say like it is great. Like I mean, Bay Area is awesome, and seeing friends out there is great, and then seeing like going to Warsaw. Poland's grown on me. A huge chunk of our
I've
engineering
never been.
organization is in the greater Warsaw area, so that's
Neat.
been a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And Tel Aviv is gorgeous. The beach there is amazing, and it's just a beautiful city. So
Yeah. Two places I've never been and would like to go. Well, one thing I'm curious about, everybody, I think, certainly in technology, and if you read the news at all lately, you've heard, I think, about various layoffs in different
yeah,
places. Who knows why, these things are necessarily happening each individual company. But I think we can all agree the last couple of years have been certainly a challenging place to do business. and to be in tech, whether it's COVID or other kind of macroeconomic things. Just curious, you've got a big team, right? And here we are, trying to build fascinating and interesting products that people care about and use. How has, whether it's the pandemic or who knows what else, how has that impacted kind of your engineering teams, your engineering effort, and I guess more broadly, just kind of the development of your products over the last couple of years?
Yeah, so Starburst was really tiny going into COVID. It wasn't under 100 people.
Really? Yeah.
I joined in August of 2020.
Yeah.
So I joined sort of mid-pandemic.
Yeah. Right at it. Yeah.
And I think I think, at that point we were physically located mostly in Boston and Warsaw with a smattering of people in Palo Alto. And I think, as we progress, we just sort of decided that the future of us, we still wanted offices and we still wanted to meet in person and those sorts of things eventually someday. But the concept of like people going into a building to work every day just sort of seemed outdated, and that we thought that we could continue to hire better and better people by being flexible. I actually really like the remote first, like sort of paradigm, in that like we can hire remote people, but we can also hire people that want to go to an office. I have engineers that go into an office every day because they want to go and they want to socialize and they want to be in an office. And so I think we're able to get like the best of both worlds from that. And it was a very realistic, evolving thing that just sort of happened, but I'm really happy with the outcome of it, in that like I feel like we can hire in the geolocales that we're present in, but also like people that just want to stay home. I'm contacting you live from my home office right now. It's, I think, I go into our Boston office on occasion, but like at the end of the day, it's wherever people feel most efficient. And I think that's especially for engineers, that's a very like practical framing, is like, well, like if you feel like it's more productive to fly somewhere, fly somewhere. If you feel like it's productive to be in an office, be in an office. If you need to work from home. And we're really focused more on the outcome of our business than like physical policies on you got to be in the office 2 days. So but I don't know if we would have made that decision without COVID, right? I think it was a very practical decision we made as we grew up in the pandemic, but I just don't think it would. I don't know if that would have been a natural decision we made otherwise.
One of the things you said to me earlier was that you thought it was kind of hard to build a product without a whiteboard. And I thought that was super interesting because I know in our experience, in my experience with our teams, you do miss sometimes, the ability to just kind of grab a bunch of folks, pull them into a room and draw something out and move on. And I think it's made the times that we are together so much more valuable. Have you found that not being together has had any impact on velocity? Because I can see it both ways, as you just kind of described. Like sometimes, you can find wonderful people in kind of far-flung places of the world, but at the same time, you miss that kind of communal engagement. What's your take on that? Has it been hard to build a product without a whiteboard? Or, I would imagine at this point you've managed through that, but I'm just curious. I thought it was such an interesting kind of statement to make about the challenges of the last couple of years.
No, and no, it is hard, right? I'd say the thing I've discovered is like tactics are easy, strategy's hard, right? Like if you're just heads down working on something, working from home is great, right? No distractions, throw the headphones on, there's nobody moving behind you, right? I'm like a person who's easily distracted by offices, right? So like for me, it was 100%, but like working through something when everybody's on Zoom and the social norms are weird and you can't just like walk up to something, it for me is like, it felt like losing a sense or something. Like it was like something was missing in the conversation that I had to devote hours to something because I just couldn't like articulate it well enough via Zoom. So, I think one of the things that our executive team has done, even through pandemic, we'd meet outside, but we met in person to discuss issues that mattered. And so from an engineering perspective, we started doing that. And that's why we established our office in Palo Alto. It was like, we needed more high bandwidth conversations to work through this stuff. And it's like, either I fly out to California for 2 days, or I spend the next 60 days in a variety of Zoom meetings trying to articulate the same thing. And so I really do think that, especially high bandwidth, like really organic design and strategy discussions were super challenging to do. And for those if people are watching and still struggling, I can't overemphasize the benefits of co-location to doing those things, because like 5 minutes on a whiteboard saves me 35 minutes on a Zoom call. So yeah, 100%.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, like, as I said, I think the times we've been able to get together, and we're starting to do that more frequently. I don't know how y'all have kind of adjusted, but I think what's happening for us at least is, the kind of offices are definitely opening back up, and there's a lot more encouragement to be back together. But yeah, it's just that time that you spend together to be able to, to really discuss, like you mentioned, those high bandwidth issues is so important.
Yeah.
So I know we're running up on about 30 minutes, but no meeting of two technologists would be complete without talking about the cloud. I don't know. Somehow we got 25 minutes into this without actually saying the word cloud, which, I don't think is legal in some states. You have to mention it.
Let's talk about the cloud. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about the cloud. I know y'all are building a product to kind of, to simplify deployment management, as are we. Just curious about maybe your perspective on that, not only, the journey, but, how has that product been received? I mean, tell us a little bit about it, but, how has that product been received in the market, and what's been that journey of building it, if you will?
Yeah. I mean, it's, so Trino is many things, but in a lot of cases, it's not super easy to configure and tune and optimize and deploy and operate, right? And so that was really the original inception of the cloud product, was like, even our enterprise product, like engineers are operating it, right? It's a self-hosted product that, is driving mission critical stuff in a business, but like they're doing the upgrades and everything else, right? And so when we designed Trino, we designed Galaxy out of the get-go, right? Like it was really like, we were looking for the ease of use axiom. So we're like, all right, like people want to spin up, people just like, well, let's not even talk clusters. People want an answer to a question, right? Like they want to submit a SQL query and get an answer. So like when we looked at that, we're like, all right, like start with small, medium, large clusters that auto shut down and auto start, right? Like, because we don't want people to have to worry about cluster management. And then, we throw in auto scaling and we throw in other technologies that make it easier. Like we're launching like our batch processing service, which is like making clusters high availability, right? So like there's a ton of things we're introducing, but it's really centered around the experience of like, people just want answers to data derived questions, right? So it should be easy to connect sources, easy to manage clusters. The system is versionless, so people don't know what version of Trino they're running, right? But that's the kind of level of thing we wanted, was, making it easy and transparent to operate the product. And so, and then, because of the sort of decentralized nature of Trino in the first place, as I sort of talked about earlier, the separation of storage and compute, like we didn't even want to be tied to a cloud, right? So, we launched our product initially in all 3 public clouds, right? And I think our eventual goal is solving multi-cloud or hybrid cloud analytics, right? Which is a problem, because the monetization policies of the CSPs make that kind of a problem, right? But like our goal really is to make Starburst the product that people can use anywhere, right? You like use anywhere to get answers to their questions, and we optimize for their situations, right? And so that's, I think approaching the problem with a bold, kind of ambitious statement of like, yes, we want to be the solution for wherever, really kind of lended itself to really driving simplicity and multi-platform support.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. It's funny listening to your description. It's precisely, I think, in a lot of ways what drives Cockroach. The ability to run these complicated systems without having to be burdened by that complexity. And you touched on something that we're spending a lot of time thinking about, which is, I think, one of the reasons why our companies work so nicely together. And that is that, the cloud is this big thing, right? But it's obviously when you get right down to it, it's a handful of key vendors that are in the space. Being able to run a product across multiple clouds is becoming important, to our certainly to our customers. It sounds like it's becoming, important to your customers. Do you see that trend continuing? It's one of those things, just quickly from my perspective, that sometimes you feel like, oh, is this a marketing thing, or are people really asking for this? I am surprised how many times we walk into customers and they are demanding that we have a multi-cloud story. Is that something you're finding as well? I mean, how has that multi-cloud journey evolved for you? Because I know for us it hasn't necessarily been easy, but it's definitely important.
We have seen it, right? That's why we're working on it, right? At the end of the day, whether people are running in multiple clouds for things like resiliency and failover, or playing the vendors off of each other for cost perspective, or acquisition is a huge use case, right? Like you're an Amazon shop, but you buy a big company that's in GCP or Azure, right? And then all of a sudden you're multi-cloud, right? And so I don't think it's, for a variety of reasons, I think it's a common scenario for all the reasons I just sort of mentioned. And I think it's a reality, right? And I think that, I don't think you have to build a cloud agnostic product, but I think if you want to solve some of the things at the scale we're trying to solve them, you sort of have to be cloud agnostic, right? And you sort of have to just embrace that reality. And, and I would say that it's an uncomfortable reality for an emerging company, because the economics of it don't 100% work right now. And because even companies that are like, oh, well, we run in all three clouds, it's a siloed product in all three clouds, right? And we're kind of trying to forego that aspect of it and try to think beyond that aspect of it. And so, yeah, I think it's kind of daunting to proceed down that avenue. But I think 10 years from now, if you're thinking like long term, the people are going to want to treat CSPs like a commodity, because no company's like being locked in. Like no company likes being 100% dependent on another business to the extent of it's like a utility, right? And I think I just think, I think it's for economic reasons, it's something that most major companies have to seriously consider.
I couldn't agree more. We're in the OLTP space, and so we get a lot of folks who have had bad experiences with vendors kind of locking them into their product for for a long time, and making that experience rather painful. And so I think when it comes to these big cloud vendors, that's precisely what we're seeing, or at least as you described, we see it for a lot of reasons. But one of the most important reasons is this idea that, man, I just came out of this bad experience being locked into something. I don't want to jump all into a cloud provider, as benevolent as that cloud provider may be at the moment. I don't want to be locked into them forever in the future. And so having kind of this optionality to run solutions in different places has become an important driver for us.
Absolutely. I think that the vendor lock-in topic is huge, right? And I think that there's an argument for why open source, or why multi-cloud, or why a lot of things, right? But I think that I think at Starburst, we focus on making a great product so that we don't have to rely on lock-in, right? Because I think that the purity of purpose there forces you to make a great product, right? So
I agree.
So
yeah, make it the thing that people want regardless, right?
Exactly.
It's just the best.
Yep.
So one thing I'm always curious about is kind of, we wrap up, is, and especially, as we talked about at the beginning, you've had such an interesting career, lots of different experiences, been at the front row of building lots of interesting things. Now, I personally have never made a mistake, but I assume others have. Perhaps you have. That's a joke, of course, for people listening. I make mistakes all the time. But as you think kind of back on your journey as an engineer, architect, SVP, I mean, are there some things, a thing that you kind of reflect back on and say, geez, I shouldn't have done that, technically, or boy, that was a mistake we made, or, just anything that, I think someone in your position with your experience, anything you can offer to people who may be listening to this to say, here was an important lesson I learned in my journey, getting to this point.
Yeah. I think so. I would say, especially at growth phase companies, if you're not actively making architectural mistakes almost every other day, I don't know what you're doing, right? Because in all honesty, you're proceeding in an unclear space and you're not 100% sure where your business is going to go. And so you make decisions. And, I think a lot of the ways that we make decisions technically is like, we try to make sure we're going through like two-way doors instead of one-way doors so we can revisit decisions later. But like, I'd say, I've run into technology selection choices or vendor selection choices. A lot of it probably revolves around like picking the wrong tech for the wrong for the wrong reasons, or not being to scale beyond a certain point, right? Like, and I think but I think those are great problems to have, because like you made a choice and you hit a level of scale where you're running into cascading failure issues because of that selection, because your product or company is successful, right? And so I think, at Hopper, like we were like super reliant on Kafka, which over time really like got progressively more complicated. And then we forked the open source and we wrote our own client. I mean, like, we did a lot of stuff to make it keep working. And then like unwinding that decision at some point, like talking to Confluent and being like, hey, Confluent, like we'd like you to host our Kafka infrastructure for us. And then being like, wait, you wrote your own client? No, get out. Right. Like so it's like things like that, right? Where at the time it was absolutely the right decision. Right. But at the end of the day, like eventually you're like, okay, we are way, way beyond where we intended to be here. And we've made it work, but like, what's the go forward strategy? Right. And I think, there's a lot of stuff like that, I'd say, in my background, in terms of like, okay, like we operate under the best possible information at the time, but Rule Allah was a great example of that too, in terms of like, it's a flash sale company. So like high throughput during like holiday season would always shed a floodlight on your bad technical decisions, because you're, getting on the one day you have to be up, you're getting flooded with requests and you're like, oh, well, all right, that's what it was this year, so yeah.
It reminds me, we did a webinar with Sean from DoorDash. This is a while back, and he said something so interesting, I thought, during that, which is, you often hear the term, things go bump in the night, right? You don't want to build systems where if something goes bump in the night, all hell breaks loose. And his retort to that, I thought, was super insightful, which is he wasn't worried about things going bump in the night. He was worried about things going bump in the day, which is like, failures happen, of course, all the time. And the worst kind of failure are those that are happening kind of right when everybody needs your service. So I thought that was kind of a fascinating way that things will break, things will fail, but and you can't necessarily predict it, but you have to be ready for it. And the other thing, I'm curious if your thought on this. I feel like at times we struggle with this. I've seen my teams and other teams and other companies struggle with this, where the phrase kind of don't let perfect be the enemy of good, I think, where, we almost spend too much time trying to find the ultimate and perfect solution, when I think what oftentimes works better is just being able to quickly iterate over maybe, a reasonable first solution, and just kind of let that evolve over time. I mean, obviously it takes care and time and feeding, but sometimes you just have to jump right in with both feet, build something kind of as you described, based on the conditions that exist in the moment, and be prepared to improve them as new facts present themselves.
Yeah, 100% agree. I think, a lot of what I coach like my teams to do is like, let's prove the concept first, right? Like let's prove an idea. Let's prove this business idea is worth investment, right? Like, don't lose sight of the eventual goal, and let's not make actions that are like counter to where we want to be. But like, you don't have to design a bulletproof system if we don't even know it's going to work. Like it's because like otherwise, it's like, get something out in a month, right? Like, let's set a threshold. Like, what's the best thing we can do in a month? And we'll vet it. We'll put it in private preview. Yeah. We'll see if customers like it. We can keep it in preview for a while, right? While we actually flesh out the real technical solution for it. But like, yeah, no, nobody gets bonus points for overbuilding. At the end of the day, like we're a business, and nobody, like, if we spend 6 months on something, we could have spent 2 months on it. Like, no one's going to thank us on how pure our system is, right? So it's so good though. It is really good.
It's the best.
It's the best. There's nobody else in the world that's built a system this great. So, but no, like, yeah, I 100% agree. And I think that's, But that's where skilled architects come in, right? Like you don't just
Agreed, yeah.
employ them for perfect technical solutions. You employ them because it's like they know when to take out the duct tape. They know when to just, all right, we'll make it work, right? But you don't fall into a trap with that, right? And I think that's really where the best technologists can apply themselves. So,
well, speaking of perfect systems, maybe as we wrap up, can you talk a little bit about how Starburst is leveraging CockroachDB today? I know we are part of, I believe, the Galaxy solution, but I'd love to hear really just a little bit about your perspective on the journey to finding it and maybe ultimately implementing, a CockroachDB in your solution.
Yeah, I mean, so for the same reasons I spoke about before, in that we wanted to be multi-cloud and resilient to being multiple cloud, like we didn't want to pick a specific CSP solution for. I mean, it started with our secret storage. Like, how do we get like encrypted secrets deployed globally in a minimum amount of time, and that's sort of how. And then it became like, what other information do we need, like globally sort of replicated, because we are a global system, right? Like we're selling to larger companies, and there are people accessing in Europe and Asia and the US. And so like the technology was selected really for that reason, which is how do we get a solution in that matches our SLAs on what we want our technology to be. And we didn't feel right going with a specific CSP like solution for it, or one of the ancillary like related Cockroach techs. So we specifically narrowed down to Cockroach because of those reasons, right? It matched our high availability and performance heuristics for what we were looking for with Galaxy, because you can imagine, right? Like if we have to rely on an external system for fetching data during operation of a query, like it has to be lightning fast. Like it has to be like there has to be a certain response time on that, because otherwise our system looks slow, right? Like, so we can't critically depend on other systems that are not sort of matching the tight, like global reliable SLAs that we have for ourselves. So.
Yeah, it's awesome to hear. I mean, a lot of what you just called out are the reasons why others have been drawn to the technology, and I know we've been very excited and happy with the partnership, and glad to count you among our customers. Y'all have been fantastic to work with. Just maybe as a last question, just as kind of we look toward the future, and again, I so deeply appreciate the time you've spent and the conversation. I've really enjoyed it. What are you looking forward to? Maybe you're a football fan and you're looking to next season of UVA. I don't know if that's true. Maybe it's a product thing. I mean, what kind of gets you motivated in the morning to kind of face what I guess we're here at the end of January is going to be undoubtedly another interesting year.
So I am a diehard New England Patriots fan. I'll just get it out of the way. This was not our year. Not our year. We've had great years in New England. This was not one of those great years.
Fair enough.
I'm always looking forward to next season now as a Patriots fan. And I'm a general New England sports fan, so Bruins and Celtics too. I would say for me, like, I mean, work is obviously a huge chunk of my life, and I love the phase that Starburst is in right now. Like, I think it's being part of a growing business, and the inertia and excitement of being part of a growing business, even with the economy the way it is really exciting. It's energizing. Everyone wants to build a great company. And so that gets me out of bed every day. I have a great team. I work with a great executive team. Like everyone is on mission, which I love, right? There's no politics. Everybody's on mission, and we're all rowing in the same direction. And that definitely is energizing. And I got 2 kids. February vacation's coming up. We're going down to Florida, visit my mom. That's always like spend some time in the pool, warm up a little bit. There's definitely a bunch of snow outside my window right now, so that's on the docket too. So,
well, Ken, again, thank you so much for taking time to speak with us. I think it's a fascinating conversation. As clearly anybody listening will see, you've got had a wonderful background and work for, I think, just a fascinating and exciting company. So thank you again for spending the time with us.
Thank you. Awesome. Thank you for having me. Pleasure talking.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Big Ideas in App Architecture. If you could, please rate the podcast 5 stars on Apple and Spotify, and we'll talk to you next time. Thanks. Bye.